St. Mark, the 9th chapter. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Please be seated. Welcome. It's one of those great words that we like to use, isn't it? To invite people into our lives, to invite people into an experience, to bring people's spirits up. It's one of those great words that just kind of hangs out there for us. And what a wonderful welcome into this time of worship that our choir just provided for us. You know, there's another word, hospitality, that talks about kind of that invitation of welcome, the relationship that a host has with their guest. That idea that the host will welcome the guest into an experience and provide for that guest and allow that guest to have a good experience. And so these words, welcome and hospitality, seem to kind of go together, and we find them in our gospel text for today. You know, a couple of weeks ago, as I was driving into worship on a Sunday morning, I had this experience, and I've shared it with our evangelism team because I thought it was just such a great experience to talk about kind of the world that we live in. And so as I'm driving up Greenfield Road and you know, just kind of watching as cars kind of jockey for position as they do even on Sunday mornings, and you know, this one has to get in front of that one, and you know, oh, well, there's 2 lanes here, so you know, I've got to go just a little faster than the guy. So I'm noticing, though, as we're getting closer and closer to Barker Road, that there's this one car. You could tell that, this car is probably turning up Barker Road. And I thought, boy, this guy's really close to the car in front of him. Just kind of pushing and pushing. And so sure enough, as we get around the corner of Barker Road, these two cars, one, kind of pushing the other one, it would seem, the car behind cuts around really quickly to get in front. And then both cars pull into the left lane to turn into the church across the street. And I thought, isn't that just kind of how we live our lives? We have this anonymity when we're driving down a road like Greenfield, right? We don't know anybody. We're not sure who they are, And then all of a sudden we find that we're going to the same place. And in reality, we probably get there about 10 seconds before the person in front of us. We laugh about that experience, and I'm sure the same thing happens pulling into this church, by the way, so, let's not giggle because it was the church across the street, but, there's this idea like we're in such a hurry to get somewhere that we just can't possibly be held back by the person in front of us, can we? And when we're honest, that is exactly the opposite of what Christ calls us to do in life. The one who is first shall be last, and the one who is last shall be first, says Jesus. And this comes in the midst of this text where he's talking to the disciples and asking the disciples, what was it that you were arguing about? And I can just imagine Jesus seeing those two drivers. Why was it you were in such a hurry to get here before the other driver this morning? Were you that excited to greet me? Or were you just in such a hurry that you couldn't think about the other person on the road? Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Then Jesus took a little child, put it among them. Taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Jesus is explaining the life of discipleship and uses this great example of a child who is there among them. So let's just stop for a moment thinking about what the place of children in Greco-Roman society was. I think to use the phrase insignificant is probably generous, actually. In fact, one scholar writes this: children, along with women, old men, and slaves, were viewed as physically weak burdens on society who had little value to the wider life of the community. In Greece and in Rome, it was an accepted practice to abandon unwanted children along the roadside to die. By taking a child, bringing them among the conversation, and for Jesus to say, as you welcome a child into your lives, so you welcome me, turns the world upside down. Which is one of those things that Jesus got really good at doing, didn't he? He took the way that the society looked at things and said, it's time to flip the world around and look at it a little bit differently. And honestly, it's easy for us to say, well, if we saw Jesus, we would welcome Jesus into our midst, right? But how many of us, when we're honest, we say we're just like that driver who had to get around that car in front of him that was going just a little too slow? That car that Jesus happened to be driving, maybe trying to remind us that we need to slow our lives down a little bit. There's this old, I don't know if it's Southern gospel or country or what you want to call it, song that asks this question: if they saw him riding in, long hair flying in the wind, would they love him down in Shreveport today? If they heard he was a Jew, and a Palestinian too, would they love him down in Nashville today? Song turns to its close by saying this and asking this poignant question: would you laugh and call him crazy and just send him on his way if Jesus came to your town today? When we're honest about how we treat other people, when we turn our backs on them, we've turned our backs on Jesus. And we've seen something about those other people that we say, you know what, they're not worthy of my welcome, they're not worthy of my time, they're not worthy of my hospitality. And there's all kinds of things that bring us to that point where we say, well, they're not quite like me, and so I'm not going to welcome that person. Maybe we see a person who has those tattooed sleeves, tattoos up and down their arms, and maybe one on their neck and around on their face, or they've got purple hair, or more piercings than we have hairs on our head. All right, I know for some of us that's a different number than others of you, but I think I still have more hairs than most people have piercings usually, right? But when we see people like that and we say, well, I don't know, they're not the family with 3 kids and 2 dogs and 2 cars in the garage and a lawnmower that works. And so, I don't know if I'm going to welcome them into my life. Or maybe the person doesn't have that same gray silver hair that we see when we look in the mirror ourselves in the morning. Or maybe they don't ride the right kind of skateboard, or they don't play the right sports, or whatever it is that causes us to see them as something different than who we are. When a coworker tells us that they're Catholic or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim, does that give us pause and to say, well, when they talk about their experience with God, there's nothing I can learn from them, or nothing that I can hear in that will help me with my relationship with God, because somehow they're just too different. Jesus turns the world on its head as he has this conversation with his disciples, welcoming children in and among their conversation. As you welcome one of these children, you welcome me. And when you welcome me, not just me, but the one who sent me. I think that's really instructive, because what it does is it invites us to see the face of God, the face of Jesus in each and every person in our lives, particularly the ones that our society has said, you know what, they should stand on the fringe. Because we value children in our society today, and so the metaphor kind of breaks down for us. But what if we look at the face of the person who's holding up that sign, "Will work for food"? Do we see Christ in that face? And do we see God in that encounter? Does that make that person worthy of at least a smile from us? A quiet prayer? Or maybe there is something we can do to help. I wonder if this teaching from Jesus was in the mind of the writer of Hebrews when these words were written. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. Angels who bring the message of God. Angels who bring a message for us. The Apostle Paul, as we heard in our reading from Acts, is welcomed by Aquila and Priscilla. Maybe first because he was a tent maker like they were, but they welcomed him to stay with them and to work with them. And from there, he was able to go out into the synagogue. And I'm pretty sure that Aquila and Priscilla, when they welcomed Paul in, didn't say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to welcome this rabble-rouser who's going to cause some trouble in the synagogue into our house, and he's going to stay with us because we know that we're going to, nobody's going to mind that he's causing trouble, right? No, they welcomed somebody in because in that person, they saw the face of God. They saw something bigger than just what was presented in front of them. They understood this idea of welcoming the guest among them. But if we're honest about who Paul was, remember it wasn't that long before this visit that he was Saul, the guy who was killing Christians. And so they take a real risk and a real chance in welcoming Paul into their lives. Then we get into this reading from this letter to the Corinthians. So Aquila and Priscilla live in Corinth, and so it's their church to which Paul writes this letter. This letter that starts out with, of course, as Paul often does, this wonderful greeting. You know, I greet you as friends in Christ and am grateful for you. Often how Paul's letters start. And then he gets into this discourse. I am so glad that I baptized none of you, because you're so busy arguing about whether you're a follower of Paul or of Apollos or of Cephas. And we say, well, okay, we as Lutherans know that we are baptized in the name of the triune God, and so we don't argue about those things, but let's replace Paul and Apollos and Cephas with words like Catholic and Baptist and Lutheran, or maybe Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or Socialist, or Packer fan, Bear fan, or Viking fan, or executive, middle management, hourly waged worker. We have our labels that we follow, and we build these silos of who we're allowed to be with and who we're not. And somehow there's a superiority in the midst of being with our people and allowing us to be hospitable only in those circles. So if we're going to break down these barriers, if we're going to break down these labels, we need to do something to change that, right? And as many of you have probably said in your own lives, or at least heard at some point, we know that change starts in the home, right? And for us, as members of St. John's, change for us starts here in this place. So over the last 18 months, our evangelism team has been working hard on making St. John's a place of radical welcome and hospitality. We've been doing a lot of little things along the way that have allowed people to feel more welcome as they walk through the door. And so we're going to show just a brief video here that's going to give you highlights of what some of those things are that we've been doing over the last 18 months to be intentional about being hospitable to others. There's a number of things that we've been doing at St. John's to be intentional. We've welcomed people and greeted them at the door, and now as the weather gets nicer, our greeters, could actually move outside, right, and open that door for people. We've got people around who, are letting people know what the resources are that this congregation has. We've invited you into opportunities to have conversation with your neighbors, and for those within a mile radius of the church, we send out postcards occasionally, and those open opportunities for us to have conversation about what's going on in the life of St. John's. And we wouldn't be honest if we didn't say that part of the reason we do those things is so that we can fill the place with more people, right? Make people feel more welcome and allow people to know what's happening in St. John's so that there can be more people a part of the ministries that we're so passionate about. But I think beyond that, one of the things that really underlies all of what we do in our hospitality and in the life of this congregation, and as we look for other people to take on some of those pieces of those roles of hospitality, is that we look to see the face of Christ or the face of God in the people who are walking through the doors of this congregation. Because we honestly believe that God has brought each and every person here to St. John's for a particular reason. For some of you this morning, that might be that you've had a particularly difficult week, and you need to be around people who are going to support you and love you. Or you need to hear a message of God's grace and forgiveness that reminds you that in the midst of all that's gone on this week, that God's got your back and it's going to be okay. For others of you, it might be having the opportunity to serve and worship and to serve others, to find ways to use the gifts that you have as a musician, a singer, gifts that you have in being able to just be hospitable to one another and greet one another with a smile. For some of you, maybe you're not even sure why you're here, but you've just felt this nudge that you need to be in this place and in this time. And that's our job as we reach out to one another in hospitality, is to see in each person what it is that God has sent each person to be here to be about, and what each person has to offer to one another. We're all here for a purpose. God has called us all here as an intentional action. Our job is very simple. It's to welcome all of the people that God has sent to us and among us. To welcome everyone as that child, because as Jesus says, when we welcome each person, when we welcome the child, the outcast, the one who seems least like us, we welcome Christ. And when we welcome Christ, we welcome the one who sent Christ. What a blessing that we have to see God's face in all of our interactions